Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Florence Schools of Regulation online workshop. Today, we will focus on some of the issues related to the renewable hydrogen, sometimes called green hydrogen, the state of technologies and industrial demonstration, current cost projections, the potential for producing, and government role in accelerating the deployment. For achieving the goals of the European Green Deal, it is expected that hydrogen produced from renewable electricity will play a key role in the progressive decarbonization of the gas sector. Dr. Fatih Birol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, recently made an interesting comment. Hydrogen electrolyzers are at the stage in their development where wind and solar were in 2008-2009. It has the potential to becoming decade's breakout technology. I think that majority of our audience today will agree that hydrogen is in need of major investment to scale it up and bring down costs. Before our workshop, we did a poll. It asked about most used clean hydrogen technology in 2050. Pyrolysis was the most popular choice, followed by some distance by water electrolyzers. Perhaps today's discussion would change this mindset. Today's workshop consists of 3 blocks. The first, introductory presentations by Deputy Director Generals of the European Commission, Patrick Child from DG Research and Klaus-Dieter Borchardt from DG Energy. The second, presentations by personalities on top of the hydrogen agenda. Oksana Dembitska, Vice President for Green Hydrogen BP, Kees van der Leuen, Director Guidehouse, Dolph Gilliland, Director, International Renewable Energy Agency's Innovation and Technology Center, and Giorgo Chatzimarkakis, Secretary General, Hydrogen Europe. The third block is reaction from 2 leading professors in the area, Katrinus Jepma and Ronnie Belmans. Our audience could put the questions or statement in the chat box. We have anticipated 2 windows in our agenda to answer for questions and answers. And I would like to finish by saying that the recording of the workshop would be accessible most probably early next week. And for your information, the recording of last week's hydrogen workshop has been accessible already from the Monday. And now, without any more hesitation, I pass the floor to Patrick Child for introductory presentation. Patrick Child is Deputy Director General in DG Research, and we are very, very happy that he could have joined us today.
So good morning, everybody, and very, very happy to be here. This kind work, and I'm delighted to be able to participate in this workshop on a topic I think which is right at the top of the political agenda of the European Union. I think if I could have the next slide, please. Europe has never devoted more political attention to the importance and opportunities of hydrogen. Already at the end of 2018, in our very important communication, A Clean Planet for All, the potential for hydrogen to become a very prominent decarbonized energy source in the overall energy mix was highlighted. And that already at a time when hydrogen was attracting more and more attention globally, starting, of course, with the G20 initiative in Japan in June of last year, but also many other organizations like the IEA, the Clean Energy Ministerial, and Mission Innovation, which is for me a particular priority given the emphasis on research and innovation in the hydrogen space. Next slide, please. Next. I mean, at a European level, this emphasis on hydrogen has become even more operational since the arrival of the new Commission led by President van der Leyen, with, in particular, two very important political initiatives in the last months. Firstly, the launch of the Green Deal and the key emphasis on the objective of full decarbonization by 2050, Europe becoming the first carbon-neutral continent in the world. And secondly, the strong emphasis in the recently adopted industrial strategy proposals a sort of strong lead on hydrogen built around the initiative that Vice President Timmermans has established for a future hydrogen alliance. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that in our discussions today. Within this overall picture, of course, research and innovation is going to be very important. Already in Horizon 2020 and previous European research and innovation programs, we have had a strong emphasis on hydrogen technology, with in particular the joint undertaking bringing together industry and academic representatives alongside the different commission services with a stake in this. And we've got some very impressive results. The €1 billion program of successful projects, including many extremely exciting demonstration projects showing how hydrogen fuel cells can in particular be applied in different transport applications. Now we are in the phase of preparing for our next framework program for Horizon Europe, which is at the beginning of next year. And one of the big topics on our agenda is the future partnership on clean hydrogen. Here we are trying to build on the success of our previous joint undertakings, but in particular to shift the emphasis also towards working at scale. In this slide, you see, firstly, enabling large-scale renewables and integration into power generation. Secondly, a strong emphasis on distribution and storage of hydrogen, and then perhaps also becoming more ambitious in terms of the applications of hydrogen, particularly in some of the hard-to abate sectors where decarbonization is most challenging. So in areas like heavy industry, steel production, and in some of the heavy long-distance modes of transport, which are a particular challenge. Next slide, please. Next. So we are working on the development now with the industry and academic representatives, and in particular with Hydrogen Europe. And I'm very happy that Yogo is here with us, and we'll be talking a little bit later. But what we are trying to do is to build on what we have done in our previous partnerships on clean hydrogen, in order to be more ambitious and to make a bigger contribution to our objective of the our intention is to shift very much towards the production, large-scale production of hydrogen, and as I said before, the distribution, storage, as well as its application in areas that so far have not been addressed. In particular, we will also have to look at how it fits into the broader regulatory policy and financing frameworks for clean hydrogen. And that's where I think that the Hydrogen Alliance that Vice President Timmermans has launched will be particularly relevant. With all our new partnerships under Horizon Europe, we're also trying to be more focused with some more quantified targets and objectives. And in relation to this partnership, we've identified three really quite challenging, stretching objectives. Firstly, that we are able to deliver hydrogen-based solutions at price equivalent to other alternatives in the energy market by 2030. That we're able to produce hydrogen cost between 5 and 3 euros a kilo 2030 will be the trigger to allow penetration to large-scale mass markets. and also to bring down the to less than euro/kilo of hydrogen by 30. Next slide, please. In the remaining part of my presentation, I'd like to touch on two important dimensions of the work that we've been doing. Firstly, on the concept of hydrogen valleys. This is the idea that we will try and insert hydrogen into a globally integrated sort of joint different parts of an ecosystem are interacting. So here you see from the production, storage, the electrolyzers, then feeding into industry, transport, heating and cooling in an overall integrated system. And this is very much, I think, in line with the philosophy that we see in the Green Deal to work in the energy system in the European market on the basis of a much stronger emphasis on sector integration. This is one of the big building blocks of the Green Deal in relation to energy, and I guess Klaus-Dieter may say a word or two more about that. Next slide, please. In relation, therefore, to the hydrogen valleys concept, we are already under the present joint undertaking, experimenting with this in a first flagship project under our 2020 work program for the joint undertaking, this Project Heaven in the northern Netherlands, which is with a budget of 88 million euros, already experimenting with the deployment at scale of hydrogen technologies. We're also working through our international engagement in mission innovation under the Innovation Challenge in Mission Innovation devoted to clean hydrogen on sharing information, and also at a European level, developing also further this concept of hydrogen values through our smart specialization platform, which brings together different sources of EU funding, including regional funds in member states, which enables us to have a bigger impact with the available budgets for research and innovation. Next slide, please. The second topic that I wanted to just highlight in these brief introductory remarks is the importance of developing electrolyzers. Here again, we have a certain track record of scaling up the projects that we've been undertaking in the existing joint undertakings, already starting with a 100 kilowatt electrolyzer project Don Quixote in 2011, developing further to these other projects. I mean, all with the idea of promoting greater production at scale, at an industrial scale. And under the next partnership, we want to go further in this direction. Next slide, please. Here, I mean, the objective is to scale up to maybe as much as 100 megawatts or 1 gigawatt scale. I mean, vital to achieve these sort of dimensions in order to bring down the costs and to make hydrogen a genuinely attractive commercial opportunity. So here, of course, we are scaling up to some extent known and existing technologies, but there is still an important research and innovation dimension in order to test and demonstrate electrolyzers in real life conditions, and also getting the sort of integration into the energy system, the smart grids, as well as safety and other issues. And so we have an important agenda where the overall potential scale of the needs have been estimated in the order of tens of billions of euros a year. And we are hoping with the future programs that we have, including a new investment agenda, particularly surrounding the research and innovation needs for hydrogen, to make a big contribution to this. As a first step, we are discussing already with our member states the possibility of a large-scale demonstration electrolyzer in the order of 100 megawatts as part of what we are calling the Green Deal call for the final year of Horizon 2020. We've identified some 800 million to €1 billion, which we can already mobilize in this year, in 2020, to kickstart some of the objectives in the Green Deal. And I'm very happy that one of those themes will be focused on developing our opportunities for a large-scale demonstrator. And finally, I should mention also the important 2x40 gigawatt initiative, which is being led by the EU's Clean Hydrogen Alliance, also highlighted in our policy communication on the industrial policy on the 10th of March. And I guess that Jorgo will want to say a little bit more about that later this morning. So if I could now move to my final slide, please, and just say that in conclusion, and to sum up what I've said, there is in the European Union massive momentum around the opportunities and the scope for further scaling up our work on hydrogen. And we see this as having a very central role in our long-term vision for carbon neutral EU economy by 2050. In the land crisis circumstances, we also see huge opportunities for the principles of the Green Deal and the opportunities of hydrogen particularly to contribute to the very necessary economic recovery from the present COVID crisis. And I think when the Commission in the next days comes forward with its proposals for the future recovery strategy, there will be a prominent place for hydrogen in that. In our work in the European Commission, we are looking in particular at the research and innovation dimension through the preparation of the future hydrogen partnership, as well as the links between that partnership and other partnerships under Horizon Europe, where we hope to see a greater embrace the opportunities of hydrogen, whether it's in the area of mobility. In all of this work, I just underline that we will be looking particularly at the whole concept of sector integration, sector coupling, and this concept of bringing together big systems around the hydrogen valleys concept. And that in order to achieve this, we will need to continue to put a lot of emphasis on production at scale through the scaling up of the existing and future technologies for electrolyzers. And just to conclude then, given the very, very strong personal support that Vice President Frans Timmermans has brought to this initiative, this is the right time to be working on hydrogen and to make it successful. Thank you very much.
Andris, you're muted.
So thank you, Patrick, for excellent presentation. Now I will ask Klaus-Dieter Borchardt, Deputy Director General from DG Energy, to make his introductory statement. Klaus-Dieter.
Thank you very much, Andris. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today again. Last week, we were focusing a bit on the blue hydrogen. Today, it's the green hydrogen. And as Andris said, the session last week was very successful because of the polls. Pyrolyzers came out first, so let's see whether we can turn it around. I hope that I can be complementary to what my friend Patrick Child has just said. I will try this. Let me start because he has mentioned the hydrogen valley approach. This is not only the approach that we are using for our future energy system in hydrogen, it is a general approach. We are trying to create for the future an energy system that integrates the whole value chain. So we are more thinking now in terms of value chains at large, and that of course requires quite some adaptations in our current framework as well. But today we are concentrating on hydrogen. It's true, we call that the hydrogen valley, where we are taking a look into the whole chain for hydrogen. And I will do the same, but I will of course spare out those areas on which Patrick has already focused on. Let me start also to make the link to our last week session on the blue hydrogen. I have already said that in our perspective, in the long-term perspective, we see clear advantages for, and I will follow the colors here, the green hydrogen, so renewable-based hydrogen, instead of the blue hydrogen, hydrogen based on fossil fuels plus CCUS and pyrolyzers, as we have seen. Why is that so? The green hydrogen for us has some undeniable advantages with regard to our overarching objective 2050 to becoming a CO2 neutral economy in Europe. If we are talking green hydrogen, that is hydrogen that comes from renewable electricity, and it is completely CO2 free. It is and can be produced by an established technology, although, and we have heard that from Patrick already, we are not yet at the scale where we should be. I come back on that in a minute. And also one element that should not be left out is that we have large acceptance for this technology. If we compare that with the blue hydrogen, here we can say that if you take the whole chain from upstream, midstream to downstream, we still have a CO2 footprint that is not negligible. It's not negligible, especially when we are taking also into account not only the CO2 footprint, but also the methane footprint, because we are still transport quite substantive volumes of natural gas in order to get then to the pyrolyzers and to the carbon and to the hydrogen. There are, of course, challenges and advantages on both sides, but for us in the long term, it is the green hydrogen that is in our focus. Now, let us have a look through the value chain of green hydrogen. The production, of course, is, as we have seen, and also Patrick has mentioned it, still very low. When you look at the current production of hydrogen at large, most of it is produced by grey hydrogen or by using natural gas. So this is, of course, the first thing. How do we want to organize the production? And let me also be clear here. We would like to see first a very strong domestic production and usage of hydrogen. In other words, creating a kind of home market first. This is essential because in discussions, very often, people are jumping immediately to imports because they believe that the production basis for green hydrogens are much better in the other parts of the world, notably Northern Africa, take Morocco with solar potentials, etc., etc. We believe that we have also a huge potential within the European Union. We just have to organize the way how we produce and come to that to transport hydrogen to the consumption places and consumption centers. The central element for the production of hydrogen is, of course, the electrolyzers. And this is a very old technology, but, and we have heard that, the problem is currently that it is still very costly. It is very costly because we do not have the right scale and we do not have the right taxation and levy system in place. Electrolyzers today are very often under pressure insofar that they are considered being end consumers and they have to bear all the levies that are put on end consumers of electricity. This is the first big problem that needs to be removed. And this has to be seen as an installation to convert electricity into hydrogen, and the end product is hydrogen and not the electricity. The second problem is the scale. We absolutely need to work on the economy of scale in hydrogen technologies. It is very encouraging what we heard from Patrick, and we will hear something more from Jorgo, that there are now some interesting projects on its way. And this, of course, is an absolute must in order to also bring costs down. Nowadays, we have the advantage still that in some regions we have excess renewable electricity, which can be used at a zero or sometimes even at a negative price, which makes a business case here and there, especially if you take into account that with the electrolyzers and the conversion from excess electricity to hydrogen, you also avoid the curtailment costs, which are still, if you take the whole European Union, go into billions of euros. So this, for the moment, is the business case. But of course, if we are thinking about replacing what is produced today under gray hydrogen, when you are seeing the potential that was also mentioned already by Patrick in the refinery sector, in the chemical sector, in the steel sector, in the transport sector, so there are huge potentials to go there. Then we need, of course, much more electricity for converting electricity into hydrogen. And this, of course, then has to come at a competitive price, and the costs, of course, also have to be reduced. Now, just to give you an example what it means, I have a figure from Germany. They say that by 2030, they would need 3 to 5 gigawatts electrolyzers capacities in Germany for covering 20%, only 20% of the hydrogen consumed today in Germany. So you see here how big this challenge is to scale up this technology. Very few words on the infrastructure side, on the transport side. It is, of course, key. We have on one side the production, and on the other side the consumption and the consumption centers, and of course we have to bring this together. How do we do that? First is that we have to make use of existing infrastructure as much as we can. We should connect here our gas grid with our power grid, the sector coupling at the infrastructure side. And we have to also refit our underground storages so that they are fit also to take in hydrogen. And this all together, if we get that right, will deliver high synergies between gas and electricity, and this will also contribute to reduce costs and increase at the same time the cost efficiencies. On this part, we are clearly working on it with the revision of the 10E regulation that is our proposal, which is due by the end of this year. And this revision will exactly do this, what I've said, that we will make an opening for refitting of existing infrastructure so that is ready for even 100% pure hydrogen transportation. We will make sure that there is a common planning between power grid and gas grid. So NSOE and NSOC have to develop here the future 10 years network development plans together, common planning which is needed. And also we will open the PCI and also the financing Connecting Europe facility for storage and hydrogen at large. Then, of course, there is the big issue of charging, if we are talking about battery-powered mobility, and fueling station, if we are talking about the alternative, which is a fuel cell approach. This is still the bottleneck for making or bringing fuel cells into also the broader private cars market, because we do not have enough fueling stations. Therefore, in the short term, we would see therefore more appliances in the public transport, buses, trains that can be used there. But over time, we would like to see a healthy competition between battery-powered mobility and fuel cell-powered mobility. And then last point here on the infrastructure is infrastructure can never be seen without looking also at the destination. And therefore, when we are discussing about future infrastructure, where do we need to build new infrastructure, hydrogen infrastructure? We need to look where is the location of our big consumers, refineries, steel, chemical, transport, ports, these kind of things. We also have to take into account that over the time, the appliances and usages of hydrogen will be very much decentralized. And therefore, we cannot only look at the big transmission lines, we also have to look at the distribution grids, which will play a central role, especially when we bring in offshore wind electricity electrolyzed into hydrogen, because it will come onshore into the distribution grid first. And the third element that we have to see is directly linked to the transport. Hydrogen, green hydrogen, will be also the starting point for developing synthetic fuels that then also can be used in aviation, for instance. So Patrick has already said a lot about the partnerships and the funding. I will stop here. Just my final word is that in the long run, we believe that the green hydrogen is our future, and this will also be reflected, but I have said that already last week and I do not want to repeat it here. And that is also the reason why you will see this reflected in our policy papers that will come out in the middle of this year, our energy system integration communication, where we will clearly stipulate that for us the priority will be on green hydrogen, not leaving blue hydrogen completely out of the picture, but it will have to play a complementary role, and over time it will be more and more taken over by green hydrogen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Klaus-Dieter. I got some questions, so I will start with the questions to Patrick. They basically are three questions. One is, what is your attitude towards blue hydrogen? Because one of the persons from the audience is saying, well, there will be not enough renewable energy, and that means that blue hydrogen could be also needed. And also there is suggested that this division between blue and green hydrogen in different studies is a bit slightly different. In some cases, it is suggested that the green hydrogen actually have more CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour compared with blue hydrogen. So that is the first question. The second are more specific. It is, do we have some special programs anticipate for electrolyzers? And third question is very concrete, but I think that could be also found in DG Research webpage. Is your statement about this Green Deal call on 100 megawatts electrolyzer? Could you tell a bit more? what type, objectives, and timing. Patrick.
Okay, thanks very much. Am I online? Is that, you hear me? Yeah. Okay, well, firstly on the discussion between blue and green hydrogen, I mean, we certainly obviously following this very closely, and big links between the production of blue hydrogen and our work on carbon capture and storage, for example. My guess is that the studies that you mentioned are where they're sort of on the CO2 emissions, making a sort of favorable comparison for blue hydrogen are based on certain quite optimistic assumptions about the extent to which the CCS can also interact with the production of hydrogen. So I think that we need to keep that in perspective. We certainly think that the emphasis should be on green hydrogen, on clean hydrogen, and that's the area where we can add most value in terms of the research and innovation contributions that we can make through Horizon Europe. And so that's why that will be much the sort of central driving future path, recognizing, of course, that there will, in a transitional period, still be a strong industrial mobilization around the production and commercialization of blue hydrogen, and that's part of the overall picture. But we will continue, I think, with a very strong focus on green hydrogen, as Klaus-Dieter has said. The other two questions on electrolyzers, I mean, I rushed a little bit through my slides, and I don't know whether they'll be available afterwards, but there's detail on the different sort of projects that we have undertaken in the gradual sort of scaling up of different the electrolyzer projects, and the proposals for the future call in the Green Deal that I mentioned are at the moment in the sort of first round of consultation with our representatives for member states. Very soon, we hope to open up a wider public conversation on the main elements in the Green Call, including this important element on the 100 megawatt electrolyzer project and the research and innovation components that go with that. And so you will have an opportunity to see what we're planning and to contribute to the sort of development of our ideas. We intend that the Green Deal call, as we call it, should be either just before or just after the summer break. So we still have a little bit of time to work with you on the design before we actually go live. But that's a little bit the plan. There was also, I think, a question that I can just pick up on whether we have a specific budget yet allocated to the work on hydrogen in Horizon Europe. And there, I mean, the answer is unfortunately not, as there's still the bigger discussion going on the next sort of 7-year budget cycle for the EU, which I think will now be also impacted considerably by the needs of the recovery from the present COVID crisis. There will be a few weeks or months yet before we have a decided budget for Horizon Europe. And then when we know that, we will then have to break it down to the different components. But what is very clear is that there is going to be a very strong political focus on hydrogen technologies going forward, and therefore a very, very robust program of research and innovation, which will be well funded in order to support this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Now the questions that I would put to Klaus-Dieter. The first question, Klaus-Dieter, is there enough water for electrolyzers? I think that is a good question because it's very simple and still we need to answer it. The second is more from your portfolio. For updated 10E regulations, will it be only for green hydrogen, or it will be also some windows for blue hydrogen? And the third is the most difficult question. It basically comes from Luis Parada and Poppy Kalesi. How to start hydrogen market, and also I think there was also from another participant also the market. How to start the market? What are the role of the targets? Production targets, demand targets, and how to replace actually natural gas by hydrogen? taking into account that it is more valuable than feedstock as compared to energy carrier. So it is a more complex question, but it is how to launch a big scale of it. So Klaus-Dieter.
Thank you very much. Let me start with the first question. Do we have enough water? Indeed, it is a good question, and they need a lot of water. I don't see that this is an issue over the next decade, but it might become an issue. That is something that we should take into account. But I do not have seen any analysis so far which have shown to us that this is now something that is imminent. But I take that point that we should take that into account when we are developing also the big scale electrolyzers. Now on your second, on the 10E regulation, it is linked also to the first question that you asked to Patrick, and let me be clear. What we have to, when we are talking about green and blue hydrogen, what we have to see is that this is to be seen in a timeline from today to 2050. And the development is gradual. So it is clear from the outset that within the next years or even decade, there will be a big trunk of natural gas in our energy system. And here I see also the chance for blue hydrogen that this could be the first thing to do is to see, can we, via CCUS or pyrolyzers, can we accelerate the decarbonization of natural gas so that we could enter or could penetrate the hydrogen market at an earlier stage with decarbonized gas, because it is clear that the development of the upscaled electrolyzers and having also the cost effectiveness of green hydrogen, that will take 15-20 years, let's be clear. So there is this time buffer in which blue hydrogen can play a very important role. So when we are making our projections, it is the time horizon 2050, which is still 30 years from now. And that also has to do now with a market. Now, how do we create? No, I have to answer the question. Yes, therefore, our 10E revision will cater for both green and blue hydrogen. So there will be no discrimination or in that sense when it comes to the infrastructure. We might build some lines which have pure hydrogen green, but that is to be decided by the market. Now, coming to the market, the first question already is whether we can just adopt some provisions that we integrate into our gas target model that is dominating the gas market today. Or do we see in the future hydrogen as a kind of commodity for which we have to create a separate market? And if that is the case, we have to make sure that the gas market, the traditional gas market and the hydrogen markets have to be connected somehow. The tendency goes into the creation of a hydrogen market. And what are the drivers there? I have mentioned it last week. I will only give you the buzzwords for it, definitions and terminology. It is about the guarantees of origin and green certificates that we need. It is about the question of targets, yes, or let me say it's a question of support. And the support can be financially. That might be the case with regard to market support, market-based support for green hydrogen. So as we did for the development of renewable electricity, we might do that for the development of renewable hydrogen. That is one thing. Do we go for targets? at EU level, very hard to see, because this is more for us a regional development. Not in all member states there will be the same development, and therefore if we look into targets, we are looking more into targets at the demand side, as we have it already done in RED II for the transport sector. And then, of course, we have to also take care of the developments that we need now. Therefore, we will create a space in which we will withdraw a lot of regulatory constraints and giving public money in order to allow for demonstration projects to be tested, so that they can go through a development that is easy to pursue, and then we can take the results and to see whether technology or a cluster of ideas can deliver a business model. And this is something what people call a sandbox, so that we give really space to try out, try and error. But what is important is that the results, positive as negative results, have to be completely transparent and accessible to everybody.
Thank you very much, Patrick Child and Klaus-Dieter Borchardt. There are by far more questions, but I can't put it because otherwise we will miss a deadline of the end of our workshop, and also there are other speakers. I would just note that for any panelists or any member of the audience, there are chat and there is question and answer window. You could also, if you wish, answer what you think is interesting for you, or to make and ask some comment. Now I would move to the second block. It is on the people that I call as the top of agenda. And I'm very glad to start with Yorgos Chatzimarkakis, Secretary General, Hydrogen Europe. Yorgos, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Andris. I hope everybody can hear me. Wonderful, and many thanks for organizing this. Thanks to the Florence School of Government of Regulation. I have prepared some slides, and if Chiara wants to put them on, that would be good. Maybe in the meanwhile, I can elaborate already to Klaus-Dieter's presentation, who without slides, as always, managed to give us a very structured approach. And he mentioned transport. I will not elaborate on transport in my presentation here. However, I want to use yesterday's announcement of two of our members, Volvo and Daimler, to really start a joint truck joint venture. So in these difficult times for OEMs, Volvo has invested some 600, or will invest 600 million into this joint venture. And what both will be doing is they will produce trucks quite early with European stacks, so fuel cell technology, and they will start immediately. So they are building it already. The announcement comes after some starting points. So what I want to say is I'm concentrating on electrolyzers, but at the same time, in parallel, there are activities going on in the mobility sector, especially in heavy duty, which is something that many people understand is better for hydrogen. So I can't see my presentation right now. Slides are uploading. Okay. Then if you allow, Andris, I would already take some of the questions that I saw in the chat, and to make crystal clear, you will see in a few minutes or seconds our logo. The logo of Hydrogen Europe is blue and green, and there's a clear reason for that. We don't want to discriminate any of both. However, we see, here you see the logo, however, we see blue as a transition, clearly as a transition technology. We are sure that the green hydrogen will, after some time, could be 7 years, could be 5 to 7 years, outcompete blue hydrogen in terms of price. And I think there will be the day where we will not anymore distinguish between blue and green, but between the content of CO2 emission in a kilowatt hour of hydrogen, or in a kilo of hydrogen. Now, let me start with my presentation. What we saw in the beginning of this year was that the shares in hydrogen technologies really went up. That's a global view. Even a company like Air Liquide, that is normally strong in still gray, to a certain extent also in blue, but they did some investments also in electrolyzer companies. So the shares went up. That was good. And next slide. But then, unfortunately, we had this crisis coming up. Chiara, next slide. I'm not sure whether I can do it. No. With this COVID-19 or Corona crisis, the world started to change really dramatically. However, we feel that Europe still wants to lead the global climate action. And that is why we also think that this post-Corona, and I don't want to be cynical here, but there might be also an opportunity. I saw that already in the chat, that there were some questions from Poppy Kalesi, the question how to scale up the hydrogen market. And similar to the post-war Marshall Plan that did not only boost the European economy, but especially also the European cooperation, as we all know, there might be a new recovery plan coming up soon. There will be a new recovery plan. And we believe that the Green Deal as such is basically the best ground, the best basis for that. Next slide, please. So we believe that there can indeed be something like a Corona climate contract, because we need both. We need, on one hand, in economic recovery, and on the other hand, we need definitely to continue the strong efforts that the European Union has done in climate protection. So, and this is not a contradiction. I have reached out already to some of the companies that are also our members, organized in the automotive sector, that came up with, I would say, a difficult message last week, that they would refrain from the CO2 regulations. I think it was a misunderstanding. However, they did not manage to communicate that right. And we want, with some dedicated projects, and yesterday's announcement of Daimler is a basis for that. But there are also other companies like Scania, MAN, and Iveco, very, very strong underway. This will definitely be overcome, this misunderstanding, and there will be some positive messages also from the mobility world. Next slide, please, shows that basically the Green Deal could be the best blueprint for overcoming this crisis, and for doing the marriage between economic recovery and climate protection. Next slide shows that Mr. Green Deal is indeed, he has been mentioned already in this presentation here. Next slide, please, is Mr. Timmermans. Franz Timmermans, the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, has not discovered, it's the wrong word, but sees in hydrogen a strong potential. If you go to the next slide, Chiara, that's him. He addressed a hydrogen congress 2 days before he started his new office, and said clearly it's he sees a pivotal role for hydrogen, and how he sees that was already discussed. Next slide, please, in a conference that we organized 2 weeks and 2 days ago with him. Next slide, Chiara. And in this conference, we brought together committed companies that would like to continue absolutely their commitment. Here you see that it was a conference with Mr. Timmermans, also with Industry Commissioner Breton, who unfortunately had to step out an hour before because of Defense Minister Council, but also Kadri Simpson, Klaus-Dieter Borchardt, Commissioner, so to say, was there. And we had already in the call the Moroccan Energy Minister, and I will explain later on why this is important, because yes, indeed, there will be a captive market and there will be also a local hydrogen production in Europe, but we need to take into account also the sun belts and the wind belts outside of Europe, and Morocco is a perfect example. Professor Art van Wijk, one of the co-authors of the 2x40 gigawatt initiative that I would like to present to you, was also, of course, there. And then you see the lineup of some CEOs, and they came indeed in person. Ørsted, one of the biggest wind energy producer offshore in the world, building upon very concrete hydrogen projects right now. But there you see also big and small companies, Enel, Aqua Energy, BayWa, and also the producers of electrolyzers, like Jon Lökke from Nel, one of the companies that is, so to say, one of the hottest companies in electrolyzer production. The biggest electrolyzer producer at the moment is ThyssenKrupp in the world. But China is catching up, but also Siemens and small companies like Sunfires were there. But also, and Klaus-Dieter alluded already to that, the ones who will distribute, will transport the hydrogen, and this is the gas infrastructure providers. I saw in the chat there was one question on the role of TSOs, and indeed, the TSOs have a very, very strong role to play, because you can transport green energy via molecules 10 to 20 times cheaper than via electrons. And here the pipeline system needs to be looked upon. Currently, repurposing pipelines from natural gas to hydrogen only would be 1/10 of the costs of building a new pipeline. And here there is, of course, some room for R&D. Next slide will show what the commissioners said immediately after this event. And if you go to the next slide, you will see Frans Timmermans tweeted, "While together we are combating COVID-19, one back, we also have to work towards a green recovery." Also, Mrs. Simpson was very clear on that. At the same time, we had issued a survey. You are too fast, Chiara. Yeah. Now next, a survey. What our sector needs, because indeed the COVID-19 crisis hits the sector. And here, okay, it's three elements that you don't see on this slide. It's one before, but stay here. Of course, the innovative companies, the small companies, suffer from major shortage of liquidity, because liquidity is taken out of this innovative fields. Large companies, and we had a major announcement of Shell together with Gasunie to invest 15 billion into offshore wind production and electrolyzers in the North Sea. I'm sure that Kees will elaborate on that. They are planning major investment, and this might be cut. And of course, the investment world could be less inclined to finance this planned growth. And that is exactly why we had this conference, in order to make hydrogen a part of the Green Deal and of the recovery plan. Now, what could be done in our survey and the questionnaire we sent to our 140 industrial member companies? We got a feedback, and it clearly says that we need clear and immediate signals that despite the current crisis, European climate and environmental objectives will be maintained and even raised, because every crisis could lead to big changes, or will lead to big changes, and this can be the case here. Also, a clear policy support in clear signals for the hydrogen industry is needed, and we feel that the commissioners involved did do this very well. So the impact of this announcement cannot be overstated. Third point was that there should be links between bailouts or financial support to strong commitments in terms of decarbonization. And that's very, very important. So yes, we also hear, we are an industrial association, we hear that recovery comes first, but you should link the recovery definitely to this strong commitment at least in the next 5 to 10 years. Also, there should be direct support to the hydrogen value chain by compensating for short-term revenue losses. We found out until the end of the year, it's about 500 million, which is the number that we need to look upon. And the fifth point goes to Patrick Child, because he is very, very active in that partnership on clean hydrogen. So far, it was called Fuel Cell and Hydrogen Joint Undertaking. So we need to provide certainty on the continuation also of research and innovation aspects. And the European Commission has done that perfectly so far. And then, of course, immediately unlock first commercial markets for green hydrogen through market incentives, but also through public funding. Klaus-Dieter elaborated on PCIs, elaborated on the 10T money that is provided for the hydrogen sector, or could be provided for the hydrogen sector for infrastructure. Let me come to the next slide, please, which shows us the initiative that we discussed definitely with Commissioner Timmermans, and he himself had the idea to include this initiative into his plans. So it's called 2x40 gigawatt initiative. Next slide. You will see that we issued a brochure that you can download on a website which is called Hydrogen for Climate Action. Next slide. Yeah, this is the paper, and we developed the paper together with non-Europeans. So 40 gigawatt would be in Europe and 40 gigawatt outside Europe. And we have here our Ukrainian friends who have ready pipelines that will be empty in some years, and they could produce, because they have also wind and sun in the east, and they are part of this initiative, like the Clean Energy Net, that's the Gulf Cooperation countries, the African Hydrogen Partnership, and a DII, which is a follow-up on Desert Tech, and very much focusing on hydrogen. Next slide shows that we have a unique opportunity to develop hydrogen right now. Next slide, please, Chiara. And because we, on one hand, have, of course, solar and wind resources, and you see on this slide that the solar resources in the northern African area are extremely high. At the same time, we need a hydrogen backbone, so a backbone of dedicated pipelines. You see here a pipeline system that is quite dense, which gives us good access to a strong infrastructure. But what we would need is a backbone. And to cover this question on water, there might be the day, Klaus-Dieter, where we need water pipelines in order to bring water to the places where hydrogen production renewably takes place. And of course, it was already mentioned, we also need storage capacity for the hydrogen. And you see on the right-hand side, you see the salt caverns all over Europe that also deliver huge possibilities to store. And round, you see different electrolyzer models that are produced by different companies. And this is all part of this roadmap that I would like to show you here. Next slide, please. The roadmap words is that we have 40 gigawatt production in Europe, where we would like to ramp up this capacity within the next 10 years. We have already a captive market of 6 gigawatt that could be used. It was mentioned, refinery, fertilizer, and we would produce 34 on top for new customers, like in industry and like in mobility. So this 40 gigawatt electrolyzer capacity in Europe would produce 4.4 million ton of hydrogen in 2030, representing 25% of the total EU hydrogen market in 2030. This shows some dimensions. In Africa and Ukraine, it's a little bit different because you have already a bigger captive market in some of these places, like Morocco, where hydrogen is already produced renewably and already used in the fertilizer industry. So it's quite interesting. And that intrigued, I think, the special interest of also the Commission. We have heard that in the college, it was not only the mentioned commissioners interested, but also others, the ones who are responsible for development. Andris knows this field very well, or the commissioners who are responsible for the neighborhood policy, because you can create value within these in this neighborhood, especially Northern Africa. Next slide shows the impact that this would have on the European economy. Next slide here, you have a total avoided CO2 emission by 90 million tons per year. And you have also a number of jobs that you would create, because this manufacturing would take place in Europe, of course, of the electrolyzers and the maintenance. So we calculated 140 until 170,000 jobs until 2030, and this is conservatively calculated. It's direct jobs because we produce something within the Green Deal which helps world climate, but it's industry, it's industrial policy. The total investment would be between 25 and 30 billion. And given the amount that I just mentioned, the invest that Shell together with Gasunie would do, 15 billion, I have to say, until 2040. But this shows that it's feasible. It's not something like science fiction here. It's absolutely feasible. Next slide will show that it's absolutely in line with the figures that Patrick mentioned when it comes to the price development of green hydrogen. So in the first phase, 20 to 25, it's absolutely important for us to really bring the price down to a 1.53 euro per kilo. That's already quite challenging. And you see here the numbers for CAPEX that we would have per kilowatt and the OPEX.
Jorgo, I'm sorry, could you wrap up, because we also have other speakers. They are
the last slide.
Yeah, thank you.
And what you see is that also the efficiency needs to be brought up. This is also an important part of this equation, and that's why we need to be still active. Next slide shows, and I will use this as the last slide, that this is not only energy policy. It's not only a policy on innovation, it's industrial policy. So if we scale up electrolyzers, we can integrate much more wind and solar using hydrogen. So we are not against wind and solar. Hydrogen is the partner of it, and it could really outcompete very, very fast other actors and players. I stop here. Thanks for the attention, and looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jorgo. Our next speaker is Dolph Gilliland, Director from the International Renewable Energy Agency Innovation and Technology Center. Dolph, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andris, and good morning, everyone. We've heard very interesting presentations, and as Irina, we very much welcome the European ambition level on hydrogen, and especially on green hydrogen. So that is a new insight, and we've been promoting that idea for some time now, with also some reports in 2018 and 2019. If I can have the next slide, please. So we receive a lot of questions from our 161 member countries on the topic of hydrogen, and we see a global interest in this topic. So there are many documents out there, many roadmaps, and now it's an issue of translating all these roadmaps into action and into projects on the ground. Next slide, please. What we see as the key challenges still is the upscaling and the need to improve the economics, and I will come to that point. Hydrogen still for some time will remain a prime fuel with a price addition, and it still makes sense, especially if we are aiming for zero zero carbon emissions also in hard to abate sectors. So especially in industry, in parts of transport sector, we think that hydrogen and hydrogen-based commodities can play a key role to decarbonize. To make that happen, we need a lot more renewable power. So the amounts are a multiple of the renewable power that is in place today. We issued a paper earlier this week about the renewable power needs just for synfuels for aviation and for shipping. And we found that even if you only replace half of the fuels in these two sectors, you would need between 1,000 and 6,000 gigawatts of solar and wind. So if you compare that with the 1,200 gigawatt we have in place today, gives you an idea of the challenge. Yet we think that hydrogen can play a key role in integrating more renewable power if we can operate these electrolyzers also in a flexible way. And in that context, we are currently conducting a new electrolyzer study to look at the economics, efficiencies, and the potentials for integrating of variable renewables. Next slide, please. So as was said, I mean, hydrogen is not an energy source, it's an energy carrier. You need to produce it from some primary energy source, but it has a wide range of applications that are discussed today. Next slide, please. So we just issued on Monday our latest global outlook and the global renewables outlook. And in that outlook, we also identified a key role for hydrogen and especially for green hydrogen in global energy transition. Next slide, please. This is a quite complex slide, but what it shows is how hydrogen, especially green hydrogen, starts to play an increasing role as you go for higher levels of CO2 abatement. In the plant energy scenarios, about 3% of the abatement would come from green hydrogen. Then if you go to well below 2 degrees, which is the transforming energy scenarios, 6% would come from green hydrogen. And then if you fill the gap between the well below and the 1.5 degrees, what we call deep decarbonization pathways, then 23%, up to 23% of the reduction would come from green hydrogen. So overall, getting from the existing policies in place to zero carbon, that is what you see at the bottom, that bar, around 8% of the reduction would come from green hydrogen and around 10% would come from hydrogen in total, so for green and from blue hydrogen. So it's a significant role of hydrogen in the energy transition. Next slide, please. And the advantage of hydrogen as an energy carrier is there is a lot of experience with hydrogen. So it's a commodity today. Around 120 million tons of hydrogen are consumed every year, produced and consumed. And we think by 2050 that may double in this transforming energy scenario, so the well below 2. It may quadruple or even grow stronger if we go for total decarbonization. Next slide, please. And the role of green hydrogen is very important. We think that an important share of total finite energy demand can be supplied by green hydrogen, around 8% by 2050, and that up to around 20% of all electricity in this well below 2 transforming energy scenario would be used for green hydrogen production. Next slide, please. And so today, only 1% of all hydrogen is green hydrogen. We think by 2050, 2/3 of all hydrogen could be green hydrogen, and around 1/3 would be blue hydrogen. Next slide, please. Now, what is critical for that is that the costs are reduced to acceptable levels. And to give you an idea, what is an acceptable hydrogen price? If you have hydrogen at $3 or €3 per kilo, then you need about 8 kilos of hydrogen for a gigajoule of hydrogen. So a gigajoule of hydrogen would cost around €25. And today, a gigajoule of natural gas costs less than €10 per gigajoule. So at €3 per kilo, hydrogen is still a prime fuel. You need to get to even lower prices. Now, how do we get there? It requires two things. It requires a very low-cost renewable electricity, 1 or 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So if we're at 4 cents, you will not reach these levels. And that is important for the discussion about, are we going to produce in Europe or are we going to produce elsewhere? Second point for the cost reduction is the cost of the electrolyzer. So Jorge already presented this $200 per kilowatt. Today, we're still quite far away from that. And also we need to be careful that we're talking here costs of projects, not just cost of the electrolyzer machine. There are also significant balance of plant costs that need to be considered. So there is still quite a long way to go to these low costs, and we should pay sufficient attention there. Next slide, please. Now, so we also see important opportunities for hydrogen in hard-to-abate sectors. One of the sectors where we had a closer look is iron and steel industry. So there are currently initiatives to produce direct reduced iron in Europe with hydrogen. But you could also think of using green hydrogen at the places where you mine iron ore and ship the DRI to Europe. So we saw it in the Commission presentation that there's a thinking also about hydrogen imports, but why not import commodities produced with hydrogen? That may be a strategy that is easier and more economic to implement than importing hydrogen. So that's an input to the discussion. Next slide, please. So also in transport, we see interesting opportunities. One of the sectors where this is discussed is also shipping, where there's now strong interest into ammonia produced from green hydrogen as a fuel. So that is currently the first tankers using ammonia fuel are being built. It's still early to say whether this is the solution that will be selected, but it's definitely high on the let's say there's a lot of attention for this option at the moment. Next slide, please. Now then, the issue of hydrogen in gas pipeline systems. A lot of attention there, but we need to be also very aware that there are important standards and regulatory barriers that need to be tackled before we can move to a hydrogen transition in this sector. So, and that's also usually an area that requires time for adjustment. So that also needs attention if you want to go to well beyond 20% hydrogen in the gas system. And then next slide, please. So this is my last slide. So as said, we see a great role for green hydrogen. We're very happy that in Europe that's now so high on the agenda, and we're happy to support this transition. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dolph, for excellent presentation and also for keeping times. That was really remarkable. Now I would like to give the floor to Kees van der Looyen. He's director and guidehouse, and I think well known to the communities that will be listening to us. Kees.
Thank you, Andris, and welcome all. Yes, Guidehouse, you might know us by our previous names of Ecofis and later Navigant. We're still there. Today I want to speak to you about a new study that we've just published actually this morning. So I also shared the link in the chat, and that's for the Gas for Climate Consortium. So the Gas for Climate Consortium consists of 10 European gas TSOs, so the transport companies, and 2 renewable energy associations focusing on biomethane. And we've been working with them for 3 years now to analyze the role that the gas infrastructure can play by transporting renewable and low carbon gases in moving towards a net zero emissions EU energy system. Most of our work so far in the report last year was about a 2050 situation. But today we've launched a pathway report, where we describe, but how could you get from A to B? How could you get from where we are now in 2020 to 2050, and what could already be done in the coming decade? We also identify there what investments and actions are needed. The central pathway in our study is called accelerated decarbonization, and it's a particular good fit with the EU Green Deal plans. This diagram shows you the development of gases in the system, where we see the role for natural gas being replaced gradually, but overall going down a bit. It's a complement to renewable electricity in our thinking. It's an integrated system thinking. We're always looking for the places where gases can deliver the energy transition at the lowest possible societal cost. You see a role for biomethane. That's refined biogas from anaerobic digestion, so from agricultural waste, but also from sequential cropping, a new agricultural process developed in Italy and France, for example. And you see there also in the blue band the growing role for hydrogen in our view on the EU energy system. Next slide, please. This accelerated decarbonization scenario, we're looking at a CO2 price of 55 euros per ton CO2 by 2030, and that should be roughly enough to see the conversion of current gray, of a lot of current gray hydrogen production, so from natural gas without CCS, by adding CCS to blue hydrogen. So that's already a decarbonization measure in industry that can be taken quite rapidly, and there are sizable projects already in an advanced stage of preparation. Then we see potential to also develop new blue hydrogen plants to some extent, and that could be based on autothermal reforming and the technology which enables a higher capture rate at more attractive costs, and that could deliver another 400 terawatt hours by 2040. When I speak about terawatt hours, you can think about the current natural gas consumption in the EU, which is around 4,500. So this would be a little under 10% of the current natural gas consumption. Those blue hydrogen hubs do not have to wait for a big expansion of renewable electricity, and as I said, they can piggyback on existing gray hydrogen production. We would expect them to develop first in industrial clusters around the North Sea, where most existing hydrogen production plants are located, and where also the possibility for offshore CO2 storage in depleted gas fields exists. Then, in our view, a European Green Deal would see a rapid decarbonization of the power sector, creating more wind and solar capacity, because of course, at first you still can use an awful lot of wind and solar to cater for direct electricity needs. So you would have to ramp up your wind and solar to create substantial potential for green hydrogen production. And then from 2030, you could see that at a really big scale, starting to feed into a combined electricity and hydrogen infrastructure to continuously serve hydrogen and electricity demand in a large part of Europe. You can also see that from work that we do for the North Sea Wind Power Hub Consortium, that at some point in time, there's so much offshore wind energy that you cannot use it for directly serving electricity demand all of the time. There will be moments that you're already exceeding that demand at the moment, and then conversion to hydrogen near the coast, storage as hydrogen, bringing it back into the electricity system or other applications can be a very useful addition. A report on that modeling exercise will be published next week, by the way. Green hydrogen needs a lot of work in the coming decade because, as other speakers noted, we're now at the megawatt scale and we're looking at gigawatt scale if you really want to go big time into the EU energy system. So a lot of R&D, a lot of demonstration projects and ramping up the capacity already. We have 20 to 25 gigawatts of electrolyzers in our scenario by 2030. You might say that's a lot less than the 40 gigawatts in Europe that Jorgo described, but you can also say it's just 2 years. There's just 2 years difference. It's the volume that the 2 times 40 gigawatt plan has for 2028. So let's not argue about that. It's in the same order of magnitude. And then after 2040, you really see green hydrogen surpassing the production of blue hydrogen when they're both around 500 terawatt hours due to rapid cost reductions on the green hydrogen side. And by 2050, 2/3, I think even more than 70% in our scenario would be green. And some of that could be imported from North Africa, but we've looked into the domestic resources, and it's also possible to build the required capacity of wind and solar for that at attractive prices in Europe. And then, of course, if the recent reports about rapidly decreasing electrolyzer costs or even already very low electrolyzer costs in China materialize, then you could see an even more rapid scale up. And we've taken that into account in our global climate action scenario, which looks at some sensitivities and some developments that may take place if the whole world chases these kind of developments. Next slide, please. And then this is what you would see in our accelerated decarbonization scenario. You see the total hydrogen demand a bit higher than in our 2019 Gas for Climate report, and that's because we now also included hydrogen for production of synthetic fuels and for petrochemicals. You see that as a separate bar there. So, and then the blue hydrogen is the dark blue. The blue hydrogen in industry is the light blue, the gray hydrogen being phased out. And there's also a small but, a large but relatively small volume of hydrogen as a byproduct in chemical industries that plays a role here. So if we could go to the next slide. Or was that already my last slide? No. Then this would be the timeline for developments in our view. But as I said, I've already shared a link to the report, so you can read that in all detail on the gasforclimate2050.eu site. The top bar shows again our view on developments in a quantitative sense. Then, of course, on the blue hydrogen side, TSOs could get ready to transport CO2 because there will be a lot of CO2 transport from CCS, especially also in this blue hydrogen production. Industry could retrofit all its gray hydrogen assets to produce blue hydrogen by installing CCS there. And then there could be the development of greenfield blue hydrogen capacity in those industrial clusters. One aspect that hasn't been highlighted before, but actually this blue hydrogen infrastructure allows you to go to negative emissions as well. Because if you in a later stage use it with biomethane instead of natural gas, then you have your BECCS, you have your bioenergy with CCS. So this is an option to consider. We're not saying that it is going to be the winner in negative emissions technologies, but let's realize that we're already building here BECCS capacity, and that if we need it, we can divert some of the biomethane and peel off the carbon and put it back in the ground, which is a negative emissions technology. We would call the resulting hydrogen then climate positive hydrogen. Then on the green hydrogen side, the focus of today, of course, a lot of research and development to be done, as has been stressed by other speakers. Industry to demonstrate hydrogen electrolysis at increasing scale, ramping up from those megawatts to the gigawatts, getting ready for rapid acceleration by 2030. And then, of course, industry to invest in large-scale electrolyzer manufacturing plants, and that's very described by the 2x40 gigawatt initiative. And it's a good fit with Klaus-Dieter Borchardt remarks about value chain thinking. This whole thing will be one big value chain. And if we do it right, it will create sustainable jobs and bring EU energy in a great position in emerging world markets as well. I think that was my last slide, Andris. So thank you very much. You can see the link here, shared it in the chat. Webinar tomorrow as well on this particular study. So you're all invited. I'll share the link to that one as well. And I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith. Our next speaker is Oksana Dembitska, Vice President for Green Hydrogen BP. Oksana, we are really proud that you could join our workshop today. Oksana, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Andris, and thank you for this opportunity. As I was introduced, my name is Oksana Dembitska, and I'm Vice President responsible for building green hydrogen business in BP. I've been with BP for 23 years, including 6 months in this newly created job, but very exciting one. So it's been a great pleasure to participate in the webinar. I actually found the discussion very encouraging, but also a good balance of realism on opportunities, but also the challenges that are facing us. So let me say a few words about how BP views potential of hydrogen and also key challenges. So thank you, Kara. So I would like to start with drawing your attention to BP's new ambition. This was announced by our new CEO, Bernard Looney, on the 12th of February. I believe it has a direct link to hydrogen. So if BP ambition could be is twofold. Firstly, it's to become a net zero company by 2050 or sooner, and secondly, to help the world to get to net zero. If we could move to the next slide, please. So here you see 10 aims, 5 aims that BP set out to get BP to net zero, and 5 aims to help the world to do so. So we can spend the rest of the time talking about this, but that's not my intention. What I do want to highlight is that we have a specific aim of advocacy, which you can see here under number 6. So this is about actively advocating for policies that support net zero, including carbon pricing. So it's really important for us to connect with the organizations represented on the panel today, including, of course, the Florence School of Regulation. If we could go back, next slide, please. So back to hydrogen. So I'll try to avoid repetition with what has already been said, but it's kind of difficult when you're the last speaker not to kind of repeat some of the points made. In terms of how BP sees hydrogen, we see it as instrumental in helping BP and the world achieve the net zero ambition. So how? So we see hydrogen as an important industrial feedstock. We're also very excited about the role of hydrogen as a clean energy carrier. For BP, hydrogen can play an important role in reducing our own emissions, particularly around our refineries, but also creating new low-carbon businesses. These are in line with BP's ambition that I showed earlier. I would like to emphasize that our ambition in hydrogen is to participate across the multiple value chains as they evolve, not just an off-take of hydrogen for our refineries. It is early days, but I'm pleased to be working with a diverse set of partners on several exciting projects around Europe. They're all, as I say, very early stage, but we're hoping to progress them to investment. So we believe that with the right policy, existing hydrogen demand in our refineries could provide an important launchpad for scaling up of renewable hydrogen. I know some speakers also talked a lot about transport, and there are much bigger plans for expansion of capacity, but we should not forget about the existing demand of hydrogen. So if we could go to next slide, please. Yeah, so many of you have seen a version of this, and this is kind of BP's adapted view of what Hydrogen Council came up with, and there were some different versions of this, I think, in some presentations today. But basically, in summary, BP sees that hydrogen demand could increase to represent 20% of final energy demand by 2050. This is in net zero scenario, I'd like to clarify. So I know there are many views out there, and ours is probably more aggressive, but we are very excited about the potential size here, potential opportunity here. So as kind of represented on the chart, we see, similar to the many other speakers and many other advocates of hydrogen, we see broad application across energy systems, and we believe particular potential of hydrogen in delivering heat to industry and buildings, where it can provide an effective solution for interseasonal storage. It could also be a valuable solution, and probably the most competitive solution, for heavy transport. As some of you already discussed today, and I know that's kind of a view out there, that the ultimate scale as well as pace of hydrogen demand will depend on policy support, development of required regulation, and investment in associated infrastructure. I would like to emphasize that with the exception of today's hydrogen usage for ammonia production and at refineries, the projected applications of hydrogen demand that you see here are effectively about creating a new demand, a new market for hydrogen. I hear a reference that hydrogen technology is where solar or wind was 10, 15 years ago, and I don't disagree with that. However, we do need to recognize that the challenge is bigger here, because whereas solar and wind were already producing energy for existing grids or for existing power consumers, we are talking about new consumers and new markets for hydrogen. That's with the exception of the two markets I mentioned. So some of this application will require more support and more infrastructure than others. So there will be potentially an evolution that depends on how big the support is required. Last week, and I think last week and some presentations today, there was a mention, I think it was Klaus that mentioned a green price of $4 to $6 versus $1.7 of gray hydrogen as a production cost. BP's calculations are very similar. So obviously, as many of you mentioned today, it is difficult for renewable hydrogen to compete. Scale, again, as most of speakers today mentioned, is another challenge. But it is scale that will ultimately drive the cost down. And I did like several speakers reference, and I think it was Dolph that mentioned about that when we talk about the cost, we need to make sure that we include overall cost, not just the cost of electrolyzer, and also that we don't forget about the cost of electricity, and also the challenge that in terms of electricity, renewable energy that's required here. So I'd like to say that I was pleased to hear today that from the European Commission about various initiatives to move industry towards hydrogen, and potential targets and support that's being worked in despite the difficult kind of COVID situation. So we're very supportive of that. We also welcome the introduction of the standards that are required for the development of hydrogen industry, as well as clarity on the definition of clean hydrogen. I'd like to say that Europe has a great opportunity to make full use of the inherent advantages of renewable hydrogen in RED II. It opens a relatively low cost and low subsidy pathway for early market entry of renewable hydrogen. So RED II delegated acts are, I see, as a make or break for any green hydrogen project, kind of in short, I think, to medium term. So we welcome accelerated timing on some of such acts, but also pragmatic approach, for example, where we talk about the definition of renewable power from the grid. I just want to say that RED II, as well as Green Deal, present Europe with an excellent opportunity to promote clean hydrogen. So let's not waste it. Let's take it. If we could move to my final slide, and I was actually slightly nervous as I was kind of hearing some other presenters, especially Jorgo, to kind of show this slide, but then I was reassured by some of the comments made by Dolph and I think Navigant about role of blue versus green. But so I have to say my focus is very much on building green hydrogen for BP, but I do see that for clean hydrogen to really make a difference and to give green hydrogen the best chance of success, support for blue is also important. So here we have a chart showing how BP sees evolution of blue and green, and this was produced, actually chart was developed in summer last year. So, based on the costs that we saw then, you could argue that maybe we're too pessimistic on the initial phase of green, but that's not kind of the debate. What we need to recognize that we need, as speakers mentioned, we need significant volumes of clean hydrogen. We need significant investment in infrastructure. And if we really just focus on green, we won't be able to justify that investment in the infrastructure, but we simply also won't be able to offer the amount of renewable hydrogen that some of the industry consumers need. So if you don't want to wait till 2040, I think it's important to recognize the role of blue and green, and I'm very encouraged to hear that many speakers today agree with that. So, and I want to say that for Europe, this is particularly relevant because Europe will need more hydrogen than it can produce ultimately, and it's good to develop its own production, and that would have to come from, as I say, both sources. So I just want to say that this is for BP. Some of you already know this is not the first time we're looking at hydrogen. We actually spent several years between 2003 to 2008 doing some projects, particularly in transport and looking at blue hydrogen, and that didn't go anywhere. But I do believe that this is different. This time it's different because there are many more drivers behind clean hydrogen and green hydrogen, including. So I am optimistic about hydrogen future. However, it will take a great deal of public and private sector collaboration to make this happen. In BP, we're excited to be part of this, and we are ready to work with governments and private companies to make this a reality. Thank you for your time, and guess we'll go to questions now. I think I was the last speaker.
Well, yeah, you have been the last speaker, but unfortunately for today's workshop, you have had a lousy chair. So, and it's somehow running late in the time. So what I could just conclude on this particular block, saying that what Oksana has emphasized, it seems from today's discussion that this time is different. I also lived during my commissioner's time with hydrogen. We have had a lot of hopes, and things has not evolved as I would expect, but this time it's really different, and you can hear from all the speakers here. I also believe that it is a new cooperation, public-private, but things are moving forward. What about your questions? So what we will do is we will follow like with the first workshop now I'm doing, we collect the questions and then we will send to speakers asking them kindly to comment on them. Doesn't mean that each question will be answered, but we will go in this way because it seems the most correct way. Then you could ask why you have planned such ambition. Well, the ambition was really to test, is it this time different? So that's why we have had such a broad scale, because you always wonder how deep is the change? Is it irreversible, or, well, there are other priorities that are jumping out. And definitely it clearly seems that it is different. But I am not professor at the universities that are doing it most of the time. And I would like now to come to Katrinus Jepma, professor who spends quite a lot of time with this from University of Groningen, to make his views known after today's discussions that we have had. Katrinus, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Andris. Yeah, I would like to give some comments, maybe start with the last point made by Oksana, which is that in order to make the progress that is needed to get to the hydrogen economy, if you like, it requires private-public cooperation. And for my first point of comment would be, having listened to the excellent presentations, both from the private sector and from the public sector, is what about the speed of the boats? Who is going to win? On the one hand, there is the good spirit, I would say, in the industry, and there's the good spirit in policy-making circles, but I have a little bit concerns if policy-making is acting fast enough to keep up with the moves that the industry is willing to take. Let me just give an example from my own country. Actually, I'm coming from Heaven area, as you know. I live in the north of the Netherlands, which is the first formal hydrogen valley from the perspective of the European Union. So we're very proud on this, and we have the Heaven project. So I always say I come from Heaven. But if we go to our country in the Netherlands, at the moment, our government is just considering to start a substantial program supporting probably also the hydrogen system. And in that spirit, we are inventorizing which initiatives are currently there in the industry to invest in 100 or maybe even 250 megawatt electrolyzers. So basically make the jump from the megawatt, from the small megawatt pilots towards the gigawatt scale that we want to achieve by about 2030. So the 100, 250. And at the moment there are 5 initiatives in the industry, Nourion, Shell, Engie, Tata Steel and BP. They all indicate that they are willing and capable in the next 2 to 3 years to install 100 or even 250 megawatt electrolyzers in our country. So the spirit of the industry is really there. Obviously, it requires support, and it requires that the policymaking is supporting this. And then the next one has mentioned already, this is the North 2 proposal from Shell, Gasunie, and the Groningen Seaports, where they announced that in 2017, they want to introduce the first gigawatt electrolyzer in our country at the Eemshaven Harbor. And that by 2030, they want to have installed 3 to 4 gigawatt electrolyzer. And there are similar plans from Engie and from Ørsted. So together, if this is really going to take place, there's going to be installed between 5 and 10 gigawatt electrolyzer by 2030 in our region. So it just all illustrates the real spirit of the industry. They see the perspective, they see the need to move towards this hydrogen system, and they're there to invest. And then my question is the policy making keeping up with this enormous ambition? Because on the one hand, if we look at the reality, we still have we only at the moment have a number of relatively small pilots, electrolyzer projects of a few megawatt only, to be honest, pilots starting up the hydrogen systems, but we have to move to the demonstration stage and to the gigawatt stage in a couple of years. So we somehow have to cross what we call in economics the valley of death, where there is the willingness of the industry, but still the incentives are not there to really move up. And we need to have, I think, a strong policy set of measures that brings us to this demonstration stage throughout the European Union. And so we are waiting for these kind of moves from the policy circle. Secondly, there are all kind of standards that needs to be dealt with if we want to, for instance, introduce hydrogen in our infrastructure, which is probably most likely relatively easily possible, but requires a lot of standardization. We have to deal with gas quality issues. We have to deal with all the safety issues throughout the value chain of hydrogen, so in production, in storage, in transport, and also in the implementation of hydrogen. So there are all kind of rules and regulations, preferably at the European scale, needs to be taken care of before the hydrogen system can really work. So there's a lot of homework there to do, and there's a lot being done, definitely, but we have to be aware that that the policy system needs to be in time to have this all installed. And then I think finally what is needed is a market. If there's not a market for the green hydrogen, then the industry will be reluctant to invest. Let me just give an example that we introduced in the Netherlands. It's related to kerosene for aviation. There is now the policy to introduce a mandatory admixing of green kerosene, which is based on green hydrogen, into the kerosene for the aviation to take off. And obviously, that's also related to the growth of the airport of Schiphol, etc., etc. But as soon as the measure was taken that green kerosene is simply mandatory for part of the aviation, you could see that the investors are moving because they see the market. They know that the price of the green hydrogen and the green kerosene is going up simply because it's mandatory, and all of a sudden this admixing mandatory policy has a real impact. So for me, the first point is will policy making realize how ambitious the industry is, and will they keep pace? Is there going to be this mandatory admixing a more general trend, so that basically the whole gas system will mandatorily be combined with the green hydrogen? Is this something that is in the air? Because as soon as that would be part of the policy mix, mandatory admixing up to a certain percentage, maybe growing in time, as we have seen it with respect to the fuels, would definitely make a big difference in the perspective of hydrogen. My second point is a bit different. It's the 40-40 gigawatt plan, which is very let's say appealing, where we would have by 2030 40 gigawatt electrolyzers in Europe and 40 outside Europe. I think it's a good plan, but for me one of the questions on the basis of the presentations was, can we compete with the rest of the world, North Africa, Middle East, etc., etc.? Because in the end, what matters is the cost price of the green hydrogen. And from the studies we have done, you can see that there are basically two factors that are driving this cost price. One is the capex of the electrolyzer, and the other is the price of the power that's of the green power that is needed to produce the green hydrogen. Well, most experts are in agreement that the capex of electrolyzers will come down between 60 and 80% during the next decade. There's not much doubt on that, and this is probably going to be worldwide. But the big question is, what will happen with the electricity price? Currently, it's about 30-40 euro per megawatt hour order of magnitude. But in order for Europe to be able to produce hydrogen green hydrogen per kilogram against the price of, let's say, anywhere between 1 and 2 euro, we need an electricity price which is in the order of 10 to 20 euro per megawatt hour. And the big question is if we are going to get there by 2030. Because if the answer is yes, then obviously we will be able to compete with our green hydrogen production. The gigawatts will be there. But if the answer is no, if the electricity price remains 30, 40, maybe even 50 or 60 euro per megawatt hour, then we simply will not be able to compete with North Africa, Middle East, etc., to produce the green hydrogen. So the 40-40 plan is dependent strongly on whether the electricity price will be half the current level by 2030 or not. So I think that is something we should take into account. Okay, so these are just some reflections based on what has been said.
Thank you very much, Katrinus. Now, Ronnie Belmans, professor from KU Leuven. What are your reflections after hearing today's workshop?
Yeah, Andris, it's very interesting to see, very interesting to hear. And I think what Katrina said at the end is very important. We need that electricity, and we need that electricity at cheap prices. So the first thing we should really look at, and you pointed also to your past and the past that hydrogen has been there, is what are the critical applications that hydrogen needs to be produced for, and we should tackle them first. So in that decarbonization process, there are a number of things that electricity cannot do. For instance, it cannot have airplanes flying, it cannot have ships moving around, it cannot decarbonize the steel industry, and it cannot deliver chemical products. So the first thing is, what do we need to do? It's very interesting to look at heating of buildings, but we can do that other ways. I would like to point to our paper that we presented on that at the Florence School of Regulation. And if we have done that, we should really look at how much we need at that moment. And if I have some views on what Oksana has been presented and Kees have been presenting, then I look at huge figures. If I look at the present electricity demand in Europe, that's 3,200 terawatt hours per year. And if I looked at some people, I think it was Oksana or it was Kees, they would like to add to that 2,500 terawatt hours. So that means a doubling of the electricity demand at the minimum by 2050, and all renewables. So that is a major challenge. So let's have a quick look and a serious look on what we have to decarbonize first, because if we can use electricity directly, we should use electricity directly. And we have seen examples of that. For instance, cars have been a major target for hydrogen. It's now electric. So let's go for that. Let's go for that first. What do we want to do? How does hydrogen feed into the overall industrial system? Second point is, and that's something I would like to see with the Florence School of Regulation, we have seen an awful lot of very interesting presentations today on hydrogen. Where is the coupling with CO2? Where is the coupling with synthetic fuels? Because synthetic fuels are a major part of the game. Hydrogen is one step in an whole process, and how are those linked? That would be very interesting to see, because I think that at this moment the two files, CO2, CCU, are split from hydrogen, and I think that the Commission should look at those two sides of the coin at the same time. If we could do that, then we could make a real step, because then we can really solve the problem as a whole and really supply the hydrogen in a hidden way to those applications which cannot be done neither by electricity nor by pure hydrogen. If I looked at the presentation of Mr. Bochard, very interesting to see, but the question for me of local production / import is a very critical one. If I look at the capabilities in Europe of producing renewables, it's going to be much cheaper when we import the fuels in one way or another. Are we really going to use the local production, or are we going to import? And I would like to point here to a very important definition. What is green hydrogen? If there is in the power system, and if we have at a certain moment, if we use green power for hydrogen production, and at the same moment there is still one power plant operating with gas, then we have, for instance, 500 megawatt that goes to so-called green hydrogen, but other demand is then supplied by a gas power plant. Is this really green? When are we really producing green hydrogen? I think that it's only at the moment that the full supply is coming from renewables. So we have to be very careful that we look at that overall system. So really, we have to look very carefully at the overall system to use the hydrogen at that point where it is best suited to do things that other people cannot do. And that's something we have to really make a fichier, as they say in French. So put a list of things that we need to do and identify those things that hydrogen is certainly needed for. Identify where hydrogen is needed to make synthetic fuels, where other things cannot be used, and then see what is the demand for it. Because making the route from electricity back to electricity via hydrogen is energy-wise not a good system. Last point is about storage. Storage is a very important factor in the whole renewable energy system of the future and also in feedstock. And we see that these days very much in petroleum, which is a very critical thing, and the petroleum prices are going negative because there is not enough storage. My dear colleagues, have a look at the energy density in volume of liquid fuels compared to hydrogen, compared to electricity, which is still worse. Those synthetic fuels, those liquid fuels, will be important to have strategic storage in future. So have a real good look at the system and have a look where we are going to, and then really invest first where it is needed. And for me, the first application of hydrogen is really the feedstock for industry, and then the supply to make synthetic fuels for those things that are needed in transport. Andris, I think I kept my 10 minutes, and that's most important. I think I gave the most important messages. Thank you. It was a very interesting talks today.
Thank you, Ronnie. Now we are coming to concluding remarks. I ask Christopher Jones, professor at the European University Institute, to start these concluding remarks. Christopher.
Thank you, Andris. I'll kind of try and conclude on the basis of this seminar with some reflections of the one we had last week to try and bring the blue and green debate together a little bit as well. I think the first, okay, let's start with some things that the two seminars have kind of clearly agreed in this respect. The first is that we're going to need an awful lot of clean, blue and green, hydrogen already post-2030. And it was interesting that both last week and this week, we kind of had a similar sort of numbers. That last week, Steph Vergoort, who's a special advisor in DG Klima, who's probably the best source in terms of numbers and evidence-based policy in that area. He said that we're going to need clean hydrogen post-2030. And today, Kees came up with a number of 55 plus euros per ton of CO2 to get the switch from grey to green. And work we're doing at the European University Institute also gets switching prices from 50 to 100 plus, depending on what you're talking about. So we're talking post-2030, we will need an awful lot of clean hydrogen. So the first conclusion you get from that is it's urgent. It's really, really urgent to get the costs of hydrogen down. And the numbers that we saw both in the blue seminar and the green seminar indicate the same thing. So the first conclusion is we need an awful lot of green hydrogen and it's urgent. So the second conclusion, and we had that today, is we need to get the costs down. And this is really, really urgent. Because I think something that Oksana said, I think really struck me. A lot of people today have said we are today where renewables, wind and PV were 10 years earlier. But what Oksana made a pretty good point, and you'll excuse me, Oksana, for misquoting you, is what you kind of said was, well, the renewables bit was easy. All you had to do was produce bigger windmills, more efficient PV panels, stick them in the ground, connect them to the grid, and then you're done. Okay? Here is a change along the whole value chain, all the way from producing hydrogen in a way we can't do yet, to getting me in my house at home to change the boiler that I have from a gas condensing to a gas hydrogen hybrid boiler plus a heat pump. So the value chain that we need in just 30 years is enormous. So action is really urgent now. An action is urgent in terms of the cost, R&D demonstration, absolutely. In terms of infrastructure, we can't wait until 2040 to make the infrastructure hydrogen ready. And third is in vertical chain, the changing my boiler, my heat pump, and also that in the cement, steel, chemicals, buses, vehicles. That's only 30 years. And kind of, I know what I was doing 30 years ago, and it's just gone like that. That's a short period of time, 30 years ago. Okay, so that's the challenge. The second thing is there's some really, really good news that we've heard in the last two seminars. The Commission and the Member States really get this now. Over the last year, there's been a real change, and I thought what Patrick and what Klaus Dieter said, Patrick's message of we're going to have a call, 80 to 100, 800 to 1 billion in July or September with the consultation period now for the horizon. The next MFF will really focus on this, the challenge of the 100 megawatts and getting costs down to 1.5 to 3 euros a kilogram was really interesting. And Jorge's 40 gigawatt roadmap I thought was really inspirational. So that's where we are. But there's still some changes that we have. And I thought it was, looking at the two seminars, it's important to notice that the Commission, both Klaus Dieter and Patrick, were really focusing on green hydrogen. But I noticed that both IRENA today said 2050, a third of our hydrogen is going to have to be blue. Kees as well said we're going to need an awful lot of blue. And Oksana noticed, I think very well, is to get to the green, you've got to build up the blue. Because I haven't heard anybody today say that green is going to be cheaper than blue in the short to medium term, unless magically we're going to have electricity prices of half of what they are today, which none of us expect, honestly speaking, or we are going to source it from our neighbours, which has its own challenges. So, and the other side I saw is that the discussion on CO2 levels and water usage in relation to green versus blue is not clear to me. I thought there was a lot of arguments on the blue side that actually green isn't as green as it is, and the green side. So we need some clarity on this, absolutely. And in this, I thought there was something, I think it was Jorge from Hydrogen Electric said, is that at the end of the day, what we want a hydrogen system that is in the interest of European citizens. It needs to be objective, evidence-based. I think what Jorge said is at the end of the day, hydrogen's a molecule. What's important is how much CO2 is in it when you consume it. And so there is still some work to be done here. So I thought that what's been done in these last two seminars is really important, really, really useful, requires some further work, but provides a very good basis to finalise. So I think, Andris, we can be very happy with what these two have achieved. And I think now is the final remarks from Tudor.
Yes, thank you, Christopher. Tudor Constantinescu, Principal Advisor, DG Energy. In a way, Mr. Hydrogen will have concluding remarks. Tudor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andris. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Thank you again for the invitation. And again, congratulations for a very good event with very interesting presentations and information, and also for gathering this discussion, which is always sensitive on the topic of green versus blue, or how to combine and what is the right combination. And thank you, Christopher, also for the invitation, also for summarizing what was already said. I would resume myself to point, because this is the seminar which was dedicated to renewable hydrogen, maybe to point some things into the direction and in support of renewable hydrogen. The situation of Europe is somehow different from other parts of the world, not only because of the commitment to carbon neutrality, but because the evolution of the energy system in relation to climate policy has shown and gradually moved into the direction of having renewables into the center stage of the energy system.
We are going to have at least 55% renewable electricity by 2030, and all the scenarios we analyzed for long-term decarbonization strategy for 2050 shows that it will be over 85%. Having all this renewable electricity and the capacities will increase significantly. We have now today 1,000 terawatt installed capacity in Europe. We are going to have over 2,200, in some scenarios up to 2,800 terawatt. And most of it again will be renewable energy and will be viable power. So for us, when we started to promote hydrogen, and Jorgo knows this very well, we started to promote hydrogen as a tool to support integration of renewables, to have the electricity grid stable, and to make good use of hydrogen actually to decarbonize transport, to decarbonize heavy carbon industries, and to make in this way the whole energy system more efficient. And the notion of a system efficiency goes behind or it's complementary to the notion of what we call energy efficiency first principle. So it has to be seen from this context. But then we, of course, discover that for a number of applications, because the hydrogen, we don't produce it for the sake of hydrogen, is to be used. And where do we use it? In industry and transport. And it's still more expensive. And maybe the end-use applications are more expensive, as we see, for example, for the cars, for the trucks. And to make them more competitive, of course, we need also to lower the cost of the hydrogen supplied. And then we said, yes, we need more competitive supply sources, and this is where blue hydrogen, which you addressed very well in the last seminar, comes in, and to acknowledge that yes, we need to scale up. We need also to have a mix of renewable and blue hydrogen, to use colors which otherwise we try not to use anymore in the energy system. Nevertheless, we should not create a lock-in effect, and everyone should be aware of this for what is renewable hydrogen. We should not create a lock-in effect, and we should be able to move ahead and to allow and to enable the technological developments to really support if the electrolyzers industry, and we heard some of the people saying even in the next 7 years we can be competitive with the blue hydrogen. Let's give a hand and make them competitive with the blue hydrogen, because on the other hand, we still need enough amounts of hydrogen that will still need to coexist, the renewable and the blue. It's not that one will kick off the other of the market. But we have to acknowledge and to enable this market for renewable hydrogen to further develop because of a number of other elements, including security of supply, including industrial competitiveness and the positioning of the European industry in this respect. So there are the elements related to energy policy, to geopolitics, and so which make also for renewable hydrogen a stronger plea in medium and long term for sure. And therefore, we have to take all these actions looking at what we need to do in short term, but also in longer term. So to work, and not to forget to mention that we speak about decarbonizing carbon-intensive industries, but the first market and the biggest revenues for hydrogen will be mainly in short term in transport. So we have to acknowledge and to move to see the dynamics which is required in this respect. Therefore, we need to look at the industrial clusters. We need to look at the coastal areas. We need to look at all maritime, railway, and heavy-duty transport applications to create the demand and to come and to support renewables as much as possible to come and to produce the hydrogen required. At the same time, of course, enabling the other sources of decarbonized hydrogen to play a role and to contributing to make these value chains more competitive when they use hydrogen. We need an investment agenda which to look at all the EU instruments, and this is what we try to do, and Klaus-Dieter already mentioned that this time, but also last time, plus the coordination with the Research and Innovation Fund. We also need to position Europe internationally in this respect, and if we promote a low carbon economy in the future and carbon neutral economy, it's clear that the whole world would like to move in this direction, because otherwise our efforts will not reach the results we aim to. And hydrogen to play this role, we need to work with the rest of the world to make sure that being in the clean energy ministerial, in International Partnership for Hydrogen Economy, Innovation, all these projects are multiplied. The ports around the world can become laboratories for making and absorbing more clean renewable hydrogen in different forms, using maybe different energy carriers, which to enable this transformation. And Europe can and should continue to lead in this respect and to work with all the industries. And I can only welcome the growing interest from all these industries, but we need to make sure that we work on a stable and sustainable pathways and not creating a hype, but really making things happening over the next coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Tudor. What's left to me is to thank first of all participants for the interest in this hydrogen agenda. Then I'm very, very grateful to all the speakers that participate. I hope you also heard something that is interesting to you, and you will appreciate also this participation. And last but not least, I have really, really thanks to Chiara Canestrini. Speakers know her well. She really did fantastic job in changing layout, in changing technology, and I really enjoyed today's event. So I was rather at ease with this new technological outline and all the preparations. Also, I would like to thank Dražen Nenadic, who also invested a lot that it was events that we can enjoy and relax. And the only thing that is missing, well, still, that we need to have more discussion. But I assume that with Christopher, we will reflect how to split the issues and having more time for debate, because this time we really try to make a big picture. And then you split the problem, try to deal with different parts of value chains, or perhaps even very small issue, only indirectly related. So we need now to move to the issues that really need to have more discussion in depth, and that is doable, perhaps on shorter seminars, not 2 hours and a half, but well, 1 hour. It's difficult, and that's why I would conclude that perhaps all of us will soon here not stay at home, but we will here go out, enjoy spring, discuss, and communicate with others. With this wish, I would like to conclude. Thank you again to everybody who is still there with us, and let's hope enjoying spring. Thank you.